There's a lot of excitement right now about the 2017 Samsung Gear 360. There's little wonder because it's got 4K resolution, it's only $250. It also has 360 live streaming. But what if I told you that there was a camera that could be even better than the 2017 Gear 360 at a similar price? It's called the Xiaomi Mi Sphere 360 camera. In this video, I'm going to show you some sample photos and videos from the Xiaomi camera, and I'm going to compare them to photos and videos from the Gear 360 so you can decide for yourself which one of them is better. So in this video, I wanted to show you some sample photos and videos from the Xiaomi Mijia Mi Sphere 360 camera, a new 360 camera from Xiaomi, makers of the famous Xiaomi Yi action camera. So in my post on 360rumors.com, I talked a little bit about the Xiaomi. I've shown you some sample photos and some early sample videos. I took some more sample photos and videos, and I tried to compare it with one of the more popular 360 cameras right now, the 2017 Gear 360, and I wanted to show you the results of what I found. So here are some test shots from the Xiaomi camera. I posted them on RoundMe, and you can see the description for a link to these photos. First, I took a couple of tests for dynamic range. Here's a test shot in a car, and you can see that there's detail inside the car, but there's also detail outside the window. And even in the darker parts of the car, there's plenty of detail. This is not an HDR mode. It's just the standard dynamic range of the Xiaomi camera. Now, here's another common scenario. This one is in a restaurant. I took the shot inside, and as you can see, there's plenty of detail. But at the same time, you can also see detail outside the window. It's not as much as the detail inside a restaurant, and there are parts that are blown out, but there's still plenty of detail to give context. There's some purple fringing here, as I pointed out in my first impressions, but that's not too difficult to correct in post-processing. I also took some low-light sample shots. Here is a sample shot in a theater hallway, and you can see that there's plenty of saturation. Usually in low-light environments where a 360 camera must use high ISO, the saturation tends to drop, but in this case, there's still pretty good levels of saturation. Not a lot of noise that I can see, although there's some noticeable grain. Now in the stitching area, there's a little bit of doubling and blurring, and part of it is due to the stitching characteristic of the Xiaomi, but part of it I believe is also due to the slow shutter speed. Unfortunately, I can't confirm this because there's no EXIF information. Now here is another low light sample in the restaurant, unedited, so you can see the original quality, and you can see there's plenty of detail. This one was taken with a mini tripod, and there's good levels of detail, not a lot of noise, and not as much doubling as in the previous shot. There's still some purple fringing here, and in this incandescent lighting, I think the camera did reasonably well for white balance. Now I also took some sample shots with the Xiaomi and the 2017 Gear 360 for comparison. So here's a scene from our backyard. It's sunlit, but there are also shaded areas. So it's a good test of many characteristics. So first, let's look at the sunlit portion. And you can see there's plenty of detail, although parts of the pavement are blown out. This is not too unusual for small sensor cameras. You can see that here, in this air conditioning unit, you can see part of the grill. and the individual lines. And here in the wall, there's plenty of texture. Now let's look at the 2017 Gear 360. Now in this same scene, the overall exposure of the 2017 Gear 360 looks similar. Parts of the pavement are also blown out, just like in the Xiaomi. There's not as much detail, but it's pretty good. Now look at this air conditioning unit. You can't see the individual grills anymore. And look at the markings here on this little toy house. You can see the detail on the Xiaomi, but not in the 2017 Gear 360. Now if you look at the wall, the 2017 Gear 360 has reasonable levels of detail, as does the Xiaomi. Although the Xiaomi seems to have better dynamic range. Now let's look at the stitching. The Xiaomi's stitching isn't perfect. There's some doubling, and in the stitching area there's also noticeable purple fringing. Again, the purple fringing can be corrected in post. Now let's look at the 2017 Gear 360. The stitching for the 2017 Gear 360 is also not perfect. There's a little bit of doubling. There's also some smearing over here. And it also has its own purple fringing, although not to the same extent as the Xiaomi. Now let's look at the shadow areas. So now let's look at the shadow detail from the Xiaomi. So here I'm looking at the wall, and it's a low contrast subject, but there's plenty of detail even in the shadow. Not a lot of noise or chroma noise. With the 2017 Gear 360, first of all, the white balance of the shaded areas noticeably bluer, and there's not as much detail. There's also a lot of kind of JPEG artifacting over here, and there seems to be some chroma noise in this area, which we did not see in the Xiaomi. So based on these sample photos, I would say the Xiaomi has significantly better photo quality than the Gear 360. The only thing is that the Xiaomi does not have a true HDR mode. It does, however, have true manual exposure, and the shutter speed goes as slow as 32 seconds, and the ISO is as low as 50. And many photographers will be able to take advantage of these exposure controls. So we've seen some photos, now let's check out some videos comparing the Xiaomi and the 2017 Gear 360. So I have here a sample video from the Xiaomi camera. Here I'm walking around the camera, at first at a close distance, and then at progressively farther distances to test the stitching. But before we look at the stitching, let's look at the level of detail. Xiaomi's resolution is nominally 3456 by 1728, while the 2017 Gear 360 has a resolution of 496 by 2048. So just from the specifications, it would seem that the 2017 Gear 360 has higher detail, but the specs don't always tell the whole story. Let's compare their videos. So here is the Xiaomi sample, and you can see the exposure is pretty good, and there's less detail in the highlights compared to the photo, but there's still a lot of detail, and the exposure is very good, with good levels of detail both in the highlights and shadows. Now let's check out the 2017 Gear 360. Now here's the sample from the 2017 Gear 360. You can see that the exposure is very similar, and the dynamic range also appears similar to that of the Xiaomi. In terms of detail, remember that the 2017 Gear 360 has a higher nominal resolution, but does it actually have higher level of detail? Let's compare. Let's take a look at the sunlit portions of each video. Here, the Xiaomi and the Gear 360 have very similar levels of detail and similar dynamic range. The main difference seems to be that the Xiaomi has a warmer white balance. Now let's look at the shadow areas. On the Xiaomi, you can clearly see the texture of the wall. On the Gear 360, the wall has lost its texture, and you can also see significant chroma noise. Now let's look at the stitching. For the stitching on the Xiaomi, it looks reasonably smooth, even though there's a little bit of doubling in some areas. Now on the Gear 360, the stitching also looks smooth, except that when the subject crosses the stitch line, there's sometimes a little bit of warping. To summarize our video comparison, we saw that in sunlit areas, the Xiaomi and the Gear 360 have similar levels of detail and dynamic range. In shadow areas, we saw that the Xiaomi actually has much more detail than the 2017 Gear 360. It also has less noise. As for stitching, the Xiaomi arguably has more consistent and less obtrusive stitching. I have links to these sample photos and videos in the description. Check them out so you can look at them yourself and come to your own conclusion. Let me know in the comments which camera's photos and videos you prefer.
So you've seen these sample photos and videos and they look great from the Xiaomi. But you're maybe wondering, is there a catch? And unfortunately there kind of is. The app for the Xiaomi isn't very polished and it's got lots of bugs. For example, on the iOS version, I often find it crashing when I'm exporting the video. On the Android version, I can't even export the video at all. And while there's stabilized video that I showed in another sample video, I haven't found a way to export this stabilized video. So there are bugs like that. In the description below, check out this post where I talk about some tips for using the Xiaomi camera so you can decide whether this is the 360 camera for you. And if you'd like to buy one, check the description as well for a link to some of the best deals for the Xiaomi camera. This is Mick and you're watching 360 Rumors, the first and still the most comprehensive website for 360 cameras with over 1,400 articles as of April 2017. Thanks for watching and please subscribe.